This is Polytheism and Process Theology. I am Professor Eric Steinhart, and you can see more of my writings on ericsteinhart.com. Let's start with the naturalistic cosmological argument, which brings us the initial universe. The initial universe is maximally simple, has no internal content or structure, it's maximally probable, requires no prior cause, it's the uncaused first cause, and it's the origin of all physicality. It's physically necessary. Now the question is whether the initial universe has any causal powers. Either it has such powers or it lacks them. Suppose it lacks causal powers, but the initial universe is the origin of all physicality. So if it lacks causal powers, then no other physical things exist. However, other physical things like our universe do exist. So it's false that the initial universe lacks causal powers. Therefore, the initial universe has causal powers. It has the power to create other universes. The power of the initial universe is self-surpassing. Here's what this means. The initial universe has causal power. Either it has the power to create something less complex than itself, just as complex as itself, or more complex than itself. Well, less complex and just as complex aren't going to do anything. So if it's not more complex than itself, then there are no things more complex than the initial universe. But there are things more complex than the initial universe. Therefore, it has the power to create more complex things than itself. It has the power to create something which surpasses itself. The initial universe, therefore, has a self-surpassing power. Now, the self-surpassing of the initial universe, what does this mean? Either the initial universe exercises its self-surpassing power or it does not. If not, then there are no other things. But there are other things, so it does exercise its self-surpassing power. The initial universe surpasses itself. It surpasses itself by creating some universe which is greater than itself. Since the initial universe is simple, greater implies greater complexity. So the initial universe creates a more complex universe. Now the initial universe is a simple, necessary first cause. It has and it exercises self-surpassing power. But anything which has those features can be fairly called a god. So the initial universe is a god. But the initial universe remains a natural physical thing. It's not a person or a mind. The simple initial God, that's the initial universe. It creates a more complex second God. The more complex second God inherits and exercises the self-surpassing power of the initial God. The second God creates a third greater God. The process repeats as gods beget greater gods. Every God has and exercises its self-surpassing power. The gods engage in what's called recursive self-improvement. The initial God creates a second God. Second God creates a third God creates a fourth God creates a fifth God. But each God can beget many gods. Self-surpassing entails that if it can, then it does. Therefore, every God does beget many gods. The result is an infinitely branching tree of ever greater gods. Here's what it looks like. It starts with the initial God. The initial God creates some second generation gods. They create some greater, more complex third generation gods, which creates some greater, more complex fourth generation gods, and so it goes infinitely. But gods contain universes. Later gods grow more complex. They contain greater internal complexity. They contain ever more complex universes. This is a kind of panentheism, which means that gods contain universes. It's also a kind of process theology, since gods beget greater gods. And it's a kind of polytheism, since there are many gods. This is what the growing complexity looks like. The simple initial God contains no complexity, but it creates a second God which contains greater complexity. That creates a third God, creating even more complexity, creates a fourth God, containing even more complexity, creates a fifth God containing yet more complexity. The complexity gradually becomes time, and it gradually becomes space and time. Gradually you get two-dimensional spaces and times. Eventually you get to something as complex as our universe. Our universe lies within some lineage of gods, which is our lineage of gods. It starts with the initial God, proceeds through some more complex gods, and eventually reaches our local God, which contains our universe. But our universe in turn will be surpassed. Our local God contains our universe. Our local God has and exercises its power of self-surpassing. Our local God will be surpassed by an endlessly branching tree of greater gods, and our universe will be surpassed by an endlessly branching tree of greater universes. That's process polytheism. Thanks.